Hi, I'm here with Thomas Fazi, who's one of the authors of the COVID Consensus, which is the global assault on democracy and the poor, but a critique from the left. You start off in the introduction talking about your book, just how it is and how it seemed very strange that many people who are very concerned about the poor, women and children, in this instance, seem to jettison all of those concerns, not just internationally and what that might mean, but also domestically, and how, where you come from the left, some people on the left seem to be even more champions of some of the impacts. Was that a real shock to you when it first started happening?
I mean, it wasn't totally a shock. I as someone who, for example, has criticized from the left the European Union and the Euro for a long time, I come from a country that is in the Eurozone, and I know all the problems it's created. I mean, I've always seen the European Union, for example, as a as an anti-labor, anti-socialist project, a neoliberal project. And so I was already kind of surprised by the left's support for the European Union. And of course, you know a lot about that in the British context, in the way the left mostly supported Remain and was anti-Brexit. And so, I mean, me, like Toby, I think we'd already grown disheartened with the left for quite some time. But at the same time, it still was a shock, despite what we knew about how much the left had abandoned its roots. We were still shocked by just, the extent to which they embraced policies that went against everything the left has historically stood for. Critique of corporate power, critique of the state capture of corporate power, critique of authoritarian policies that sweep away civil liberties in the name of whatever happens to be the emergence of the moment. These are all things, the transfer of power from the national to the globalist level. I was part of the anti-globalization movement, and these are all things that the left used to stand for. And yes, this was all jettisoned, almost from one day to the next. And so yes, of course it was a shock. And one of the reasons that I think pushed us to write the book was also to try to understand how by this point former comrades have come to support all this.
It's very noticeable as well that you cite quote at the start that we're going to be faced with future pandemics, almost like as an inevitability quickly, not necessarily over the historic period we might have thought about. To what extent do you think some of the experiences of jettisoning pandemic strategies and imposing lockdowns and restrictions is now seen as a go-to toolkit for various rulers internationally?
Absolutely. I mean, I think a lot of people might tend to think that what we saw during the pandemic, as bad as it may have been, was a one-off event. And that is over, and at least in a country like the UK, it might seem like most of the pandemic is in the past, and now, we've almost returned to normal. I think that's a very short-sighted vision. The point was not that, of course, they weren't going to keep lockdown going forever. Of course, they're not going to keep boosting people forever. I mean, clearly that was bound to end. But the paradigm that they created with the pandemic, this idea that in the name of an emergency, a crisis, a war, which can also be understood in metaphorical terms, such as a war against an invisible virus, in the name of what happens to be the emergence of the moment, all constitutional guarantees, all constitutional liberties, all constitutional rights can be swept away. And, critical voices will be censored brutally, offline and online. Critics will be demonized. They'll be accused of being enemies of the state, of being of committing treason against the state. So that's a paradigm that has emerged with the pandemic, and even as the pandemic recedes, the paradigm remains, and it can be redeployed for future crises. It could be another pandemic. I think that would be a bit too much even for them. I think, for example, we're already seeing the deployment of the same paradigm, the same approach, the same techno-authoritarian approach with the war in Ukraine, for example. Same kind of totalizing narrative, which is harmonized across all the media, same censorship of dissenting voices, same demonization of anyone that goes against the officially sanctioned narrative. So much of the toolkit that we saw applied during the pandemic, we are now seeing applied with the war in Ukraine. And so I think yes, this is the new normal that we have entered, but it's I think it should be understood as a form of Accordion-like authoritarianism. Where freedoms can be, widened and restricted depending on the moment. So it's a stick and carrot. Of course, they're not going to keep people locked down forever. They're not going to keep, so at some point, of course, they have to open the accordion a bit. But whenever they want, they know that with the right narrative, they can close the accordion back. They can restrict those freedoms once again. And we know that if they find the right narrative, most people will go along.
So you're saying if they find the right narrative, but you also said there's no need for conspiracies because it's all out there. I mean, it begs the question who the they are that have got this accordion. Is it like a myriad of different things that are happening that influences, or that's the first question. When you say they, what do you mean by that?
You can avoid the idea that there's a room where, 5 or 6 people that decide everything, while at the same time recognizing that power and wealth today is concentrated in the hands of a relatively small global elite. And we know who they are. They're the people that gather every year in Davos for the World Economic Forum. We're talking the wealthiest people on the planet, the multi-billionaires, the multi-trillionaires, the biggest corporations on the planet. They clearly, you don't need to have a single deciding actor this doesn't disprove the idea that you do have elites. You have economic and political elites that to a certain extent do coordinate. They converge even physically in places like Davos and in other places. And of course they have their own vision for the future. An institution like the World Economic Forum, it's not, of course, Klaus Schwab doesn't, just hatch up plans by himself in his evil cave and then just pass them out to governments across the world. He acts as a kind of, go-between between corporate and political interests, and it's in these contexts that, elite will does emerge. They do have plans, but it's not just a few people. It's more widespread than that, and there are converging interests. There's not like one cabinet, one world cabinet with a world government that decides everything. You have converging and to some extent even competing interests at the geopolitical level, for example. So it's not that clear cut. But clearly we know we're not the ones deciding policies nowadays. So if we're not deciding, someone else is deciding.